real, a dummy in a hammock. I need a break.
Sometimes it's nice to turn away from the hoax videos and the viral ads to look at the work of brilliant artists who pioneered the visual effects techniques we now take for granted in our one-click meme making. From primitive to complex, from dazzling to totally invisible. Even if you don't use them, VFX are worth learning about, because they're just plain cool.
Maybe I do make too many Back to the Future references, but I have a perfectly legitimate excuse. I really like it.
Back to the Future is a story about a couple of friends going to unbelievable lengths to protect each other, their loved ones, and the world from destruction by a ridiculous, yet somehow really cool, garage-built invention. And if they succeed, the best they can hope for is that nobody will ever even know. Responsibility for the entire universe secretly in the hands of one kid and one crazy guy.
I used to be a kid. Now I'm a crazy guy. The trilogy has a way of staying relevant to me.
And the half-decade during which it was produced happens to be a pivotal time in the history of visual effects, led by the company that made them for these films, Industrial Light and Magic. ILM's logo used to be a magician coming out of an industrial gear, levitating a light, but now it's just a gear and a light.
'Cause the magic's on the screen, baby!
The Back to the Future trilogy is a fascinating time capsule of effects evolution. The first film's handful of lightning and time-slice shots were hand-drawn by animation supervisor Wes Takahashi and relied on the same optical matting techniques as the earliest effects from the dawn of cinema. Those storm clouds are made of fiberfill, by the way, shot upside down at time-lapse speed while visual effects supervisor Ken Ralston crawled around on the floor under them, flashing a 1,000-watt light on and off. By the time Part 3 was in production, ILM was using film scanning and digital compositing to put some shots together pretty much the same way we do today. But it's the second film that contains the most interesting assortment of techniques. Flying cars, holographic displays, floating hoverboarders, and cloned actors all interacting in free-flowing camera moves.
Today, some label all this computer graphics, while others are quick to point out that no, all this was done by hand before computers were even a thing. But neither statement is totally accurate. Let's figure out exactly how computers were involved.
3D animation already existed, but in primitive form. It's used in the movie as almost a parody of itself. The wacky backdrops of Max Headroom-style video waiters, advertisements on the hollow billboard, and of course, the holographic Jaws 19 marquee. At the time, CGI seemed destined to stay in the world of cheesy TV graphics, and it would be another 5 years before it reached the realism of Jurassic Park.
So every proper sci-fi element you see in Back to the Future 2 was done with practical, handmade miniatures. A real camera filmed a real, tangible object with all of its imperfections and tricks of the light.
This is a real 8-foot miniature building chock full of light bulbs. This is a real miniature police hover car made of vacuum-formed plastic. This is a real 5th scale miniature DeLorean with little servo-articulated Marty and Doc in there. That's so cute!
I just want to touch it all and play with it all day long. Of course, in all but a few
cases, like the epic steam engine crash at the end of Part 3 where everything in frame was modeled at quarter scale, the miniatures usually needed to be placed into real-world background plates. But computers weren't involved in that either. The blue screen process was done photochemically and assembled on 2 custom-designed optical printers in use at ILM at the time. One was nicknamed the Quad, the other the Workhorse, but actually they both used to be one giant printer called the Quad. It's a long, incestuous story. The point is, we've got the cinematography covered, but the model still had to move. Now, in a handful of shots, the full-size mock-up, as well as the 5th scale miniature DeLorean built by ILM's model maker Steve Gawley and his crew, were simply hung from cables and puppeteered in real time. But generally, this doesn't offer a lot of control over the motion. That's why really old miniature work looks so fake.
If you want real control over the motion, you need motion control. See, stop motion looks the way it does because you're just estimating how things need to change from one frame to the next and moving them by hand. But if you could have a robot move them for you based on precise calculations, then the resulting movement would look perfectly smooth and realistic.
The earliest motion control camera rig used on a large scale was the Dijkstraflex system, built by a team of ILM engineers for the space battle sequences in a sci-fi story
dreamt up by a strange young man named Jorge Lucas. He also founded Industrial Light and Magic as a division of Lucasfilm to make the effects for the movie. I think it was called Star Wars. Star Wars? Star Wars.
The iconic POV shot flying into the trench of the Death Star, the Dijkstraflex made that possible, earning its namesake John Dykstra and the other developers an Academy Award in 1976. This early system was just a hardwired camera crane controlled by transistor logic that moved around stationary models. By the time the Back to the Future films were in production, ILM had a more advanced, computerized rig called the Vista Cruiser. Finally, computers! Now the camera's position, rotation, lens settings, even shutter sync, with another 8 channels left for moving the models, could be controlled simultaneously.
The idea is you program the actions of the camera, the model, and any lights or moving parts that have to animate ahead of time, and then the rig films it by itself, frame by frame.
The advantage is not just that the motion is nice and smooth, but that it can be repeated multiple times. When you don't yet have the luxury of digital compositing tools, this is the only way to make things look right. By lighting each take differently, you end up with passes that can be combined in the printing process to isolate the model and match its look exactly to the background photography. For instance, many flying car shots in Back to the Future 2 were in high-contrast night scenes, and this was hard to simulate on blue screen without spilling a ton of blue on the highly reflective DeLorean, making it transparent. So a bright fill pass was filmed against blue just to generate the matte of the car's silhouette. Then high-contrast beauty passes were shot against black, and all were composited together to achieve the final shot. Multiple passes were also used to assemble different models that had to work together in one shot. The intro scene of the Skyway has dozens of miniature elements that were shot individually and choreographed to one camera move. By the way, it's 1988 and match-moving software is not really a thing yet, so when you see dozens of individually animated Skyway cars tracked perfectly into a freehand crane move, that's a human. A patient human named Charles Clavadasher calculating and programming the movement by hand. I can barely get an advanced 3D camera solver program to keep things from wobbling around in 2017, and I had to click like one whole button.
A frame-by-frame motion control system like the Vista Cruiser is great, but what if I want to do effects with things that are alive, like actors? I'd need a system that can move in real time. Another man once shared that dream. This guy. This nerdy-looking guy named Robert Zemeckis. He's the mastermind behind Back to the Future. Judging by the confused expression on your face, I feel I need to pause here and explain something very important.
The first image on the first frame of the first Back to the Future movie is a title card containing the name Steven Spielberg. This leads many to believe that Steven Spielberg made Back to the Future. And let's get this straight. Spielberg is an amazing, legendary filmmaker who, as executive producer, provided the resources and opportunities for up-and-comer Robert Zemeckis to get Back to the Future made. But Zemeckis co-wrote and directed all 3 films. He made every creative decision. These are movies by him. Steven Spielberg is to Back to the Future what YouTube is to Captain Disillusion. Would Captain Disillusion exist without YouTube? Probably not. But should YouTube be praised for the amazing works of awkwardness that are the earliest Captain D episodes?
I don't think so. That's something I alone have to live with.
After the runaway success of the first Back to the Future, Universal was dead set on making a sequel, but Zemeckis wasn't interested because he doesn't like to repeat himself. He didn't want to be pegged as the Back to the Future guy. Oh. Eventually he agreed, but only if he was allowed to make a different film in between. So he directed Who Framed Roger Rabbit real quick. It only won 3 Oscars and was only a slightly revolutionary achievement in integrating live action and cell animation into a well-developed story where iconic cartoon characters from competing studios shared the screen for the first and last time in history, but in fairness he had to rush through it so he could dive straight into concurrent production on Back to the Future 2 and 3, flying daily between Burbank and Sonora to supervise post on one while shooting the other, going on on to direct a string of phenomenal films in all kinds of styles, and single-handedly dragging performance capture filmmaking into the Hollywood mainstream, this man does not compromise on creative vision. So it's his headshot, with a possibly fake autograph purchased on eBay, that hangs on the wall of my office.
Creative ambitions of directors like Bob Zemeckis push visual effects technology forward. And for Back to the Future 2, he insisted on another breakthrough that would profoundly impact the way we shoot effects films today.
Between all the flashy flying cars were scenes of characters interacting with themselves from another time, the same actor playing both parts through the use of the second oldest effect in cinema history, the split screen. Early filmmakers would do split screens in camera by blocking part of the frame on the matte box, filming one side of the shot and leaving the other side unexposed. Then they'd wind the film back, swap the matte, and shoot the opposite side while preserving the already exposed side. As long as the camera stayed still and the seam of the double exposure could be disguised on an object in the shot, it worked great. They were even getting fancy with it pretty early on. A good example is the 1921 Buster Keaton film, The Playhouse. Here he is portraying members of an entire orchestra, some stuffy audience, comedians on stage, and a... Oh no, let's get out of here. 70 years later, Robert Zemeckis was determined not to compromise the cinematography of Back to the Future 2 with static angles and artificial pans and zooms for the split-screen shots. He wanted the camera to move freely, as in the rest of the movie. So in each of these seemingly simple dialogue scenes, it needed to be driven by a motion control system in real time.
Of course, these days, real-time motion control rigs are available at every corner web store, but in 1988, they were a little hard to come by. Some early ones, developed by pioneers like John Whitney and Bill Tondreau, already existed, but these were cumbersome machines, impractical to transport, and way too noisy for dialogue scenes.
So an entirely new, silent, and portable system had to be created by Industrial Light and Magic engineers Mike Bowles, Udo Pampel, and Mike McKenzie, especially for Back to the Future 2. It was called the VistaGlide. Built on a modified Panther dolly, it could move on a linear track, boom vertically, and operate a 200-pound VistaFlex camera with perfect repeatability. It was the most advanced system of its time.
And we're going to take it for a test drive. To help me demonstrate how the moving split-screen shots were done, I've called on the acting talent of London-based YouTuber and fellow Back to the Future fan, Ami Yamato.
Hello.
Are you ready?
All set.
Excellent. But we won't be using an ordinary slate for our scene. Instead, we'll trigger the whole system and mark the exact same start frame each take with a bloop light.
We begin by carefully planning the scene's blocking and camera angles. Then, the camera rolls and Ami acts out the A side of the conversation while a stand-in reads the other lines. I operate the camera, and the VistaGlide records every nuance of the movements as they happen. When we finish a take we're happy with, we have to commit to it because Ami leaves her cup in a spot from which her doppelganger will pick it up. It's very important that nothing on the set moves a millimeter, or we'll have to start over. During the most complex motion control scene in Part 2, when Michael J. Fox plays 3 members of Marty's future family, filming took 3 days, and all the props had to be glued down to ensure consistency. The shoot was nearly ruined when an earthquake struck and moved the VistaGlide rig. Luckily, they had just finished filming 3 hours earlier. Back on our set, Ami is transformed into her second character through the magic of wardrobe and makeup. We relaunch the VistaGlide, programmed with the motions of our earlier chosen take, and a video system plays back the take itself. Hearing audio of her own performance, Ami acts out the other side of the scene as the camera repeats its motion in perfect sync. By the way, each axis of movement in a motion control rig is handled by a channel, and in the VistaGlide there were 16 of them, which means it could control more than just the camera. In a few split-screen scenes throughout the sequels, it also moved objects in the shot. When Tom Wilson passes the almanac to himself in Part 2, his hand actually rests on a rod to which a solid metal replica of the book is securely attached. A motor rotates it across the split-screen boundary in sync with the camera move. And on the B-side, it's the hand of a double. In Part 3, the plate Michael J. Fox hands himself as Seamus McFly is also controlled by a rod later removed with a clean background pass. With both sides of our scene finally filmed, we can roughly combine them on set to make sure things line up. And of course they do, because the VistaGlide is awesome, and so are the ILM engineers.
And so is Ami Yamato. All right. Well, see ya.
Wait, aren't you going to take me back to England?
Oh, yeah, just talk to someone in the production office. I'm sure they'll take care of you. All right, people, we're moving on. Lots to do.
There was still the small matter of creating a clean optical composite of the split-screen footage.
Using a traditional animation stand, they shot backlit cells with carefully painted shapes that defined the exact split.
The camera mount on this animation stand was also motorized and could be programmed with keyframes, so the shapes were visually match-moved to the camera motion in the scene. This black and white mat was then used in the optical printer to expose one side of the film frame at a time for the final composite. And they didn't have to hide the splits on obvious lines in the scene. ILM Optical Department's Stuart Robertson and John Ellis figured out how to make the double exposure edges almost completely seamless. The splits could sit in the middle of anything and even fade to a different spot during the shot. This is what made it possible for characters to hand things off to each other and cross into each other's space.
If it sounds complicated, it was, because the high-quality picture had to stay on weird strips of cellulose acetate every step of the way. But then, as Part 2 was being finalized and Part 3 went into post-production, history began to change.
Film scanning and digital manipulation tools were maturing, and ILM's computer graphics department was taking center stage. Sandra Ford Karpman was one of its earliest members and worked on all kinds of subtle enhancements to Michael Lantieri's physical effects throughout the sequels. Wire and rig removal in the hoverboard sequences, this crazy moment when the DeLorean pops a wheelie on the train tracks, cables connected the nose to air rams hidden in the cab. Also digital blue screen work during the climactic train scene because it was impossible to key Mary Steenburgen's purple dress optically without severely shifting all the colors in the picture. ILM had come a long way from the pencil-drawn lightning bolts in the first film, but there's one shot that perfectly captures the evolution of effects in the entire trilogy. Fittingly, it starts the middle act of the second movie when Marty and Doc return from the future to drop Jennifer off at her house. The DeLorean flies, makes a clean landing, pulls into the driveway, and Einstein strolls out of it. A seemingly unimportant moment depicted with an incredibly complex visual effect in true Zemeckis style. Just think, a motion control split screen is being used to hide the real car driving off a platform on the right side of the post with a pass of the empty street. Then, a detailed miniature DeLorean lit and animated to line up perfectly with the real one by Peter Dalton using nothing but his eyeballs is shot in multiple passes optically composited into the scene and rotoscoped to disappear behind the post.
To me, the moment the DeLorean touched down in this shot is the moment the visual effects industry truly came of age. It proved that effects are not just for spectacle, that they can become an indispensable part of visual storytelling in films of all genres. And sure, they're not perfect in Back to the Future.
The whole trilogy is full of imperfections. The headlights aren't reflecting on the miniature side here. The cap is cut off by the split screen in this frame. Marty's got 3 hands for a moment. A diffusion silk and a flying rig are clearly reflected. The stunt guy has a super red face. Hello, short shorts. You can see a little wheel there. And during the heartfelt conclusion of the entire journey, this little guy is pointing at his But you know what? I've honestly never noticed any of these flaws. I got swept away by the story, and I still do.
When I watch Back to the Future today, I still root for Marty, laugh at Doc, and get goosebumps when the time machine appears on screen. And as much as I know about the details of the visual effects, I forget they're there. All I see is an epic cinematic adventure that managed to remain timeless.